Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's Popular Music Books in Process series event featuring Charles Kronengold talking about living genres in late modernity, American music of the long 1970s with George Lipsitz. As always, our gathering connects the Pop Conference, IASPM US, and Journal of Popular Music Studies. My co-organizers, Carl Wilson, Kimberly Mack, Francesca Royster, and Gus Stadler. And let's see, is there any organization-related stuff about those? That all? I guess the Pop Conference is sending out acceptances this week, so hang on to your seats for that. And I think IASPM's global gathering is also, so it's a big week to find out where you're going to be talking about popular music yourself. This series, which has been bi-weekly for a little bit, will be weekly through February, just to catch up on some backlog of great books from last year. So we've got Mark Anthony Neal talking about Black Ephemera on February 6th, Lynn Melnick and Deborah Predis on Dolly Parton and Other American Divas, February 13th. February 20th, we move to the world of Leeds post-punk, the Mekons and Gang of Four with Gavin Butt. And then February 27th, it's a biographies week. Timothy Hoover on King Curtis, joined by RJ Smith on Chuck Berry. So lots of fine material to come in the weeks ahead. But for today, really, really happy by the speakers and that you're about to encounter. Charlie Kronengold was wowing people at the Pop Conference with his musicology 20 years ago. We waited patiently for this book to come out, and now it has. Okay, that's the informal biography. I'll do some of the formal one too. He has published articles on modernist classical music, post-war popular music of the Americas, urban cinema of the US and Hong Kong, and such topics as the harpsichord fad of the 1960s to 70s, and perhaps my favorite, the role of accidents in popular music. Alongside of living genres in late modernity American music of the long 1970s, he's also, we are told, finished the other book we've been waiting for all these years, crediting thinking in soul and dance music. So happy to see that in the bio as well. With Adrian Daub, he wrote the James Bond songs, pop anthems of late capitalism. He teaches music, film, and aesthetics at Stanford, where he has done a lot of things with a lot of departments. Okay, I'm moving on. George Lipsitz, living legend, is, and I think if I'm right, one of Charlie's dissertation people is going to be talking with him about the book today. He's research professor emeritus of Black Studies and Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, edits the Insubordinate Spaces series for Temple University Press, co-edits American Crossroads series for UC Press. And then there are all the books that we have on our shelves, things like Time Passages, Dangerous Crossroads, Footsteps in the Dark, the Johnny Otis books like Midnight at the Barrel House, Fierce or Urgency of Now, Insubordinate Spaces. A great, great set of work, and the perfect person to take Charlie's incredible musicology into the social realm as well. So really looking forward to this conversation. Afterwards, we'll have plenty of time for questions from you all in the gathering. That's where the chat function comes in if you're new to the series. We really encourage people to not only post questions, but comments as the conversation goes. The participants aren't going to look at those, but Carl, who's handling the Q&A, will, and he'll call on people at the end of Charlie and George's time talking together. We'll also share the chat text with our presenters after the fact. All right, I think that is everything. Looking forward to this. Take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Eric, and thanks to everyone for making this possible. You know, we always know more together than we know individually. And looking through the faces and names, you know, I see bibliographies and books and articles that have been tremendously important to so many people. And I'm glad we have the opportunity to convene in response to this extraordinary, wonderful, and infinitely generative book that Kronengold has written, Living Genres in Late Modernity. This book is important because of what it knows. It displays an extraordinary depth about genre, not only in music, but in literature and in film. It has an encyclopedic understanding of many different forms of music, but it also has the courage to ask and answer complex social questions that are related, that illumine the meaning of the music. The great W.E.B. Du Bois said that the purpose of education is to be a fine instrument of adjustment between life as it is lived and life as it is described. And I think all of us who work in any kind of music studies know that there's something missing, that the disciplines have taught us to disaggregate things into categories. And so the secular, the sacred, and the scientific are studied separately. The people who study musical texts often don't study their social and historical context. People who write about one genre don't see its connections to others. And there's value in splitting things up in this way. I don't want to be disrespectful of all the things we've learned from this approach, but I think I didn't realize fully what was missing until I read Living Genres in Late Modernity, that it misses the connections, the contingencies, and the contradictions that you get from a deep involvement with the infinitely plural and diverse practices of music and social life. So I want to pose some questions for Charlie about this book. We can't possibly do justice to it in this time we have allotted, so everyone should go out and buy it. And this being almost February, it's close to Christmas, maybe you can buy one for each and every member of your family. And I promise you, you won't be disappointed. But Charlie, I do want to, let me give a brief summary of what I think you're doing, and then I'll have some questions for you. First, I think that this is a profound book on how we hear and understand music, how we connect texts of music to their social and historical context. And I think most surprising and wonderful to me was the way in which attention to the temporality of musical composition, performance, distribution, and reception illuminates how change over time is lived and negotiated subjectively and objectively through forward and backward gestures. How a decade like the 1970s, which can appear incoherent if we want to compare it to the Roaring '20s or the Depression era '30s, the 1970s are marked by senses of both loss and belatedness, while presenting fundamentally new, innovative ideas and practices. And to me, that's what temporal moments always have, even those that are attached to simpler formulations. So, Charlie, you have a claim in the book that was surprising to me. You call genres self-theorizing entities. So what does it mean to call genres self-theorizing entities?
Yeah, that's a hard question, but it's a good question, and it is. I think I'm talking about. Oh yeah, I think I'm talking in that moment in the book about how it helps us to hear songs as doing self-reflexiveness of certain sorts, as talking about what they're doing. And there's a Parliament song where I think it's really doing that with the songs Forebears among some of James Brown's work. And then I'm saying that that kind of self-reflexiveness, when you look at the kinds of self-reflexiveness that happen in songs in a given genre, patterns will emerge. You'll see that there's self-reflexiveness around certain aspects of that genre, maybe about how you wear clothes or about what you think about drum sounds or how you use reverb or what song lyrics are supposed to do, but there may not be self-reflexiveness around others. And that when you kind of aggregate that, you take all the songs that are participating in a genre and you kind of look at the ways they're self-reflective and the ways they're not, you start to see that these genres can theorize themselves through that, by emphasizing certain parameters and de-emphasizing others. And so, to broaden that out, because I think, there is something to be said there. And again, I thank you for that provocation. That one of the things that genres do is they can tell us in general way, individual genres can tell us in more generalizable ways, what are genres good for? Why do people glom onto them or not? Why do people avow them and disavow them? What kinds of work do they do when songs are trying to put themselves in the market? you know, that kind of thing. Each genre has generalizable insights into the field of genre. How do genres relate to each other is going to be a question that punk will answer very differently from disco, even though they're happening at the same time and interacting with each other. So, is that a beginning of an answer to a very good question? I hope so.
Yeah, well, it indicates that there is no pure genre. The genres are made as they happen. They're fixed in the mix. They're negotiated. The song that you mentioned, where they're even in the recording, they're saying, "Can I get you hot? Can I get you
Hmm.
high?" And they don't necessarily know where that's going to end out.
Right.
They're doing it as they go. And I think this goes against what we've been taught. And you do a very nice job early on talking about the way film theorists and literary theorists and musical theorists tend to treat genres as fixed and finite forms that can be reduced to particular figures and devices. And yet you describe them differently. You describe them as a dynamic constellation of heterogeneous about that, this dynamic constellation, heterogeneous elements. It seems that the whole nature of genre is to winnow down
Hmm.
these elements and have a pure and predictable form, although every generic work signifies on what came before, and it has to be predictable, but it has to be novel. But this term really stuck to me, this dynamic
Hmm.
constellation of heterogeneous elements. And you don't just assert this, you prove it again and again through particular pieces of music. And I wonder if you could elaborate on it.
Yeah, I mean, this connects with your first question. And, I should say that in using language like that, I'm very happy to be following, David Brackett, whom I see here, and Georgina Bourne, whom I see here, or I saw her a moment ago, hope she's still here, who've used language like this too. And it's again to remind us that every genre um, handles the different dimensions of genre differently. So while some genres might say a lot about form, like the concerto, for example. Other genres, like the nocturne, have very little to say about it. And some genres might have a very strong visual presence, while others leave that dimension more or less untouched. And so, by thinking about if we're taking a particular genre, which dimensions come to the fore? What does it mean that a genre like disco can have something to do with form, something to do with drum sounds, something to do with hairstyles, something to do with independent recording labels, something to do with a new medium like the 12-inch single, something to do with this new mode of being a person, which is like the disco consultant. What is a disco consultant? That every genre has some strange configuration of these many, many different dimensions and many different aspects and features that change over time and that, again, are just very different from one another, one genre to the next.
Well, and this leads me to a follow-up question, that one of the things I think you do so well is to show the work that genre performs. I remember there was a Bosley Crowther of the New York Times reviewed the Howard Hawks film Red River, and he said, "At last, a film with no message, just a good old-fashioned shoot 'em up." And Red River is all about empire. It's about conquest. It's about capitalism. It's about
Yeah,
theft. But because he could fit it into certain generic conventions, he assumed none of that was there.
yeah. Yeah, and and that's a great example. It's also an example where the things that come to the fore for different
Ang
readers
sabar.
tell you how much work a particular film can do that it participates in. So you have, like, I mean, John Ford's reaction to that film famously was to tell Howard Hawks, like, I didn't know that dumb son of a bitch could act, And it's definitely like a film that is, as a, sort of a portrait of an actor, it's an amazing film too. So yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that the book tries to attend to, the ways that, individual songs can, in a sense, rewrite the history of the genre, the histories of the genres that it participates in. And you get sometimes with somebody like Thom Bell, for example, we've got quotes from him, sometimes unpublished at the time, but findable, where he's pretty much talking in those terms. He says everything we do is experiments, and every time we do a love song, it's got to be of a different color, it's got to be a different form, it's got to be something new about it. And that's, in some ways, that tells us a lot about how genres work, you know, even if it's unsuccessful, that people will attempt to rewrite the history of a genre through their one song that they're, recording under time pressure and money pressure and institutional pressures of all sort. They'll still have time for that, in the same way that Parliament and that song you're mentioning, they can devote, 7, 8, 9 minutes to can we get you hot? May we make your temperatures rise? Like what does that mean even? What is that distinction about? Maybe nothing, but maybe, maybe something, or maybe the nothing is the point.
Yeah, but I felt I was going to school with every chapter, that there were pieces of music that I thought I knew well, that I saw I didn't know at all. And there were pieces that were unknown to me. And I thought, wow, I got to listen to this. This is amazing. And you do that not only through a deep engagement with the musical figures and devices, but with the social and historical context. And this, I wasn't trained in musicology, and so I come to it looking music as evidence of social change and history. And the musicologists often respond by saying, well, that's epiphenomena. That isn't really the music. We're talking about the music. Well, you're making a claim, as you say, that the funk flashlight is the music, um, the mothership is the music, even though it doesn't appear to be musical. That guitar shorty going on the Gong Show and playing the guitar while standing on his head is the music.
Hmm.
Wilton Crawley in the 30s playing a Dixieland number and taking his clarinet and taking all 6 pieces apart and juggling them because they think of it as enrichment.
Like Thom Bell, occasionally talking about what he's doing and getting a picture of just how much goes into a song, and how much contingency there is in a song's being one way rather than another, or being a hit or not, or speaking to people and influencing later songs or not. And a lot of this comes out of hearing these musicians say, as we've been threatening to talk about this song, and indeed I have not been able to do a book talk on this book without talking about this song, the Stylistics, people make the world go round. It's just, I don't know. I'm going to be hopefully forever identified with this song from now until forever. But that's a song where likes were going on. That was when people were demonstrating, boycotting, laying in, fall-ins, sleep-ins, walk-ins, talk-ins, you name it. The ins was in. But so that's okay, the desire to write a message song rather than any particular message you want to deliver, right? So this is in the height of the political ferment of the late 60s, and he's seeing what's going on around him. He knows that the music he's interested in is responding to that, and that meant a lot of music outside of the soul sphere he was operating mostly within, pop spheres he was operating mostly within. Musical activity you can think of interacts with another set of contingencies that has to do with making records in Philadelphia. One of the things that makes this music of the 70s special is, we could put it in the bluntest terms, just refined sonics, imposingly refined sonics. And that happens in New York and Los Angeles and a little bit later in Philadelphia and, not too many other places for a while until, things start to get, moving in that direction. This was a critique of Motown that you hear Thom Bell and some of interlocutors talk. Stop, Look, Listen to Your Heart from a little bit earlier that was released as a single first. And that song, sounds great. It uses the strings. It sounds markedly better than equally inventive songs like, Ready or Not by the Delphonics and, Didn't I Blow Your Mind This Time by the Delphonics of a little bit earlier. Um, but with that song at a hit, and only with that song a hit, Thom Bell was able to go back to AVCO and say, like, that's the kind of money, that's the kind of resources I need for this whole record, this whole LP. And People Make the World Go Round was definitely conceived as an album cut, something that too is a fairly new development around 1971, where you're going to have these long groove driven songs that can't work as singles in that form, you know, because you're not going to have a 7 minute, 6.5 minute single.
Yeah.
So all of these kind of commercial, political economy, money questions, they all bear upon things that are, big aesthetic points and that affect things that are in as purely aesthetic a realm as what we call musical form, you know. And it matters that the musical form he comes up with is a very specifically, Afro-diasporic, even Afrocentric form, which is, driven by grooves, vamps, long stretches of focus on the rhythm section. In this song especially, which for its second half just has no singing whatsoever, right? So
Well, this is, an amazing analysis that you give us of People Make the World Go Round. And you connect it in that section of the book to the OJs for the Love of Money and Wake Up Everybody. And I wonder, particularly with the OJs piece, what's the comparison and the contrast with People Make the World Go Round? Why put For the Love of Money after People Make the World Go Round?
yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are some important things that they share, and one point that I'm trying to make in the book in a broad way across a lot of genres is that, an individual song is often more interesting for what it shares with other songs than with what makes it singular, and in the world of classical music, that can be a bitter pill to swallow. It's not the way we're normally talking about classical music, to say about a Morton Feldman piece that what makes it interesting is the things that are generic about it, conventional about it. But that is, I think, often the case with those pieces. But with this, it's important that they're both songs that are long, groove-driven songs that give their second halves up to just a short one measure or two measure vamp. And the Harold Melvin song you mentioned, "Wake Up Everybody," does the same thing. It just gives its second half over to a short repeated bass line. So, those similarities are really key. The main differences are number one, because this is something that matters a lot with Philadelphia Soul. People Make the World Go Round is one of very, very, very few songs of that first half of the 70s where you have a woman contributing something really significant to one of these long groove-driven message songs or any kind of long groove-driven song in Philadelphia Soul. This is something that, for bizarre reasons, was mostly a male province. And you can understand that part of this is because these songs came out of the recording studio environment, and as Bell says in another interview, Creed, he says, was one of the few women who was down there with us. And so the fact that she's there behind, the scenes, behind the glass for a long groove-driven song and, a message song at that was a very rare thing, while For the Love of Money by the OJs was more typical in that it did came out of this all-male rhythm section world, that Leon Huff, Gamble and Huff, Leon Huff was the one who would be in the studio directing the musicians and often playing piano himself, along with Bell sometimes, or keyboards. That's such a male realm that it was much more typical to have kind of an all-male situation around those long groove-driven songs. So that's one significant difference. The For Love of Money is much more typical of Philadelphia Soul in that regard. Another is that it does this great thing that I was just seeing Guy Ramsey, who did the talk in this series a couple of weeks ago, writing about the great songwriter Twinkie Clark. And one of the things he mentions about her is something that I've always, loved about her work, and that I was so glad to see somebody put down on paper finally, which is that she mixes biblical phrases from the from the King James version with Black vernacular expression. So the whole set of references that go into that song, For the Love of Money, make it really special, starting with that biblical phrase that gives the song its name. And they reconfigure it, as I explain in the book. They change the grammar and syntax of that phrase to make it work very differently in the song than it does in the Bible. But it is this King James Version phrase that is powering the song and giving it its title, that does a lot of the work, but it's happening alongside allusions to Bing Crosby's Depression era message song, Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? It quotes the sort of 1830s, 1840s phrase, Almighty Dollar, and it does a lot of just kind of African American vernacular English too, as well as many other kinds of English. And that mix of elements does in the realm of the lyrics what I think a lot of the music is doing, which is to point in different directions, to draw on different sources, different genres of music, different ways of putting together a song, different bodily modes of interacting with instruments, different kinds of expression and levels of expression, different degrees of conventionality from this very, very weird drum beat that we have in that song, and the unusual bass line, that quite unusually Anthony Jackson, the bass player, got co-songwriting credit for contributing. It's one of those songs where it's just, it's very interesting for the range of things it includes, starting again with that biblical phrase that gives it a certain kind of authority in the lyrical realm. And since I mentioned it, starting with a bass line that gives it a certain kind of novelty and, Afro-diasporic punch in the musical realm. A song that literally begins with a bass line alone, with a very strange sound played with a pick with this phase shifter. There's one of these wonderful 70s details that adds even more to it. It takes the reverb away entirely for a few seconds before bringing it back in. And this is before other instruments enter, so that you're already getting the sense that parameters which were fixed and below the level of attention are now demanding your attention, and they're part of where the work of the song is going to be happening. So, you know, that kind of range of stuff in both lyrics and music, with the kind of authority that the bass line gives it in the musical realm, and the authority that the New Testament King James Version phrase gives it in the lyrical realm, that's something that makes this song really special, I think.
Yeah, well, I have one more question, then I think we can throw it open to the group, for discussion.
As we normally care about, if we're talking about a genre of popular music like disco, is equally interesting when we attend to a genre of music like the concerto. And so the concerto is one of those genres that, like disco, can do a lot of work even when the people who are making the music completely disavow their participation in that genre. So you can get pieces that dissimulate about what they're doing, by giving it a title that says nothing like the concerto, or by trying to comport themselves in a way that suggests that the traditional oppositional strategies that composers have used in configuring the relationship between soloist and orchestra are now non-conflictual, or that the traditional ideals of virtuosity that go into the solo writing in a concerto are now going to be, sort of either reconfigured to be a very different kind of virtuosity, or it's going to be something that is going to reject virtuosity altogether. All of this happens with the very legible principles of the concerto in the backdrop, and those include things like virtuosity and things like solo orchestra alternation, for example, and the structural return of certain elements. So my contention is that the way a genre like the concerto works is that, you know, when a particular example of a piece for solo and orchestra rejects those norms, it's still being heard in light of those norms. And that's because those norms are very powerful and memorable, and in some ways still present in the ears of the people who hear these pieces. And in some ways, it's because as the 70s unfold, there are still zillions of people writing traditional three movement tonal virtuosic concertos for all the usual instruments, piano, violin, cello, trumpet, and so on. So that's how a genre like this can work. With disco, similar things can happen. It's like the concerto, but maybe special in the intensity of it. A genre where many of the people who did it best were very busily telling everybody at the time that they didn't like the genre, they didn't care about it, they didn't go to discos. I mean, listen to Shaka Khan talk about I'm Every Woman, for example. You know, she has no truck with this. I mean, the idea that this would be a disco song is just vaguely insulting to her. But that doesn't really matter on the dance floor, and it doesn't matter that much in the history of the genre in terms of what it influenced and what it connects with musically and how it works on the dance floor in relation to other disco songs that we're more happy to avow their connection with that genre. But it tells us something about how the genre could function, you know, so that you get all of these new wave and post-punk artists doing things that in formal terms work like disco, in material terms are bought and sold like disco on 12-inch singles, on dance floors were heard alongside disco records. And so, you know, we take that into account along with those disavowals that the artists are not really doing disco or that disco is over by then or and so on. So, I mean, that's an important part of how these work. With jazz, that you know, a genre I only talk about in passing in this in the book, but that obviously I've thought a lot about, and that's a great place to kind of ask this question. One of the things that makes jazz special in the 70s is how, and this is like the classical music that I'm talking about, how it enters the commercial spheres that we normally associate with popular music in ways that are a lot more granular and specific, partly because jazz is more consciously interacting sonically as well as in terms of song choice with other genres of the day. So the fact that you could get, you know, you'd always have, I mean, decades earlier, people doing popular songs of the day who are jazz artists doing it in a different fashion. But in the 70s, you might also then have, well, since this is a baseline driven song that we're covering and the bass line's played on an electric bass, I'm going to use an electric bass in this song too, and that's something that, you wouldn't have had in the earlier 60s. That starts to, fact that jazz can start to interact with these other genres by taking in the sounds, the people, the practices, the places, the record labels, as well as the songs, that changes jazz a lot. And, it means that things, start to either count as jazz or not count as jazz for jazz listeners that are still, selling as jazz on the Billboard jazz charts, that are still being released by the major jazz labels, like Blue Note and so on, but that a whole set of critics and, fans are saying are no longer jazz. And so that's something that, you know, yeah, I wish I'd written more about, but it's something that it definitely matters when you get these soul songs that engage with those players, those labels in that world, like the Esther Phillips version of Home is Where the Hatred is a song where I talk about jazz a lot. And even in the Philadelphia soul world, that song that you mentioned, the Harold Melvin and the Blue Note song, Wake Up Everybody, one of the things that that song does is draw upon the kind of spiritual sorts of modal jazz that were important at the end of the 60s, like Pharoah Sanders and Alice Coltrane. And then, when you listen to that song, it gives you a reason to say, well, a lot of those Philadelphia soul musicians actually played that kind of spiritual jazz. And, Billy Paul's, original jazz trio, they helped, become part they formed, they stayed with him, in the Philly soul days, some of them, and then they were in this group Catalyst, which is one of these key kind of early 70s spiritual jazz groups. And I could put this into the chat. The playlist, the bonus tracks playlist for this chapter, can I copy this? Um, is one of the things it includes are the Catalyst version of the song East and Billy Paul's version of the song East. And you can hear this is the playlist for this soul music chapter that has the songs we've mentioned and then a whole host of other songs I mentioned in the chapter. Um, this is something that, yeah, it definitely like makes the sorry, I can't. I completely lost track of my thoughts. I'm not one of those people who can put things in the chat and talk and think at the same time. One out of three is probably what I can do. Anyway, but thank you for the question, and perhaps I answered it, perhaps I didn't.
Yeah, well, I think you did. And is there anything we haven't covered that you would like to alert people to?
Well, just because this came up a little bit in the beginning before most people had joined, that the first chapter talks about this crazy late 60s pop. 1968-69 is a moment when people were making these pop records that were wheeling harpsichords, sitars, oboes, choruses, bells, and all sorts of crazy stuff in and out. And, many of these records did not become popular, but some of them kind of did. And I think that they do important cultural work. And then, just to add that, in the disco, new wave, and album-oriented rock chapter, I'm talking about a lot of songs from the early 80s. And so I was on a radio show, and the host was like, "What do you mean by the long 1970s? That must be a typo." What I mean to say is that there's a set of cultural formations, and musical formations that occupy that 15-year stretch. And I think a lot is really going on within that stretch that can be viewed coherently. So I make a point of kind of starting, when a lot of these things are happening musically, and when people are already starting to say that the 60s is over in an important sense, by 1968. And I continue until, things start to change musically and culturally as the Reagan era really kicks in and the AIDS era starts. And, in musical terms, we're shifting from analog recording to digital, and from the live rhythm section to, drum machines and, sequencer triggered keyboards and so on, that there is this kind of coherent 15-year stretch from about 1968 to 82, 83 that the book focuses on. So I'll just signal that. And um, I'll thank you again, George, and attempt, if I can, to put one more thing in the chat. One of the things about writing a book like this is that the decision about what genres to talk about and what genres to not talk about is, for me anyway, was very tough. And so just so you can kind of get a sense, I'm putting in the chat another playlist, a much longer one. This is about 160 something songs. This is for a course on music of the 70s, and it includes pretty much everything I could find on Spotify that is listed on the syllabus for this course. And I don't know if it's more ecumenical, but it does kind of give a sense of, if I could have talked about all the musical genres that I would have wanted to talk about in the 70s that do the kind of work that, George has been alluding to and that I've been trying to get at today as well. Salsa, música popular brasileira, country, southern rock, progressive rock, just regular kind of ABBA, Carpenters pop of the 70s, stuff going on in Mexico. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I would have wanted to talk further about. And so, this playlist gives you a little sense of if this were going to be, a giant cube of a book that had, 1,700 pages in it. I would have loved to have had chapters on some of these other genres as well, but that'll give you a quick sense. But anyway,
Maybe
I
that'll
don't
be
want to
the,
delay questions any further, and I haven't been able to look into the chat yet, so I'm very curious to see what
yeah.
people have said.
Well, maybe that 1700 book will be the next one.
Yeah,
There
exactly.
was,
And I'll self-publish it, and I'll turn into the Unabomber, right?
yeah,
Um,
I think Philip Togg did an 800-page book on the song Fernando by the group ABBA. And I always wanted to review it and say, this is a good start, but the definitive work on ABBA has yet to be written.
yeah, exactly.
But
Yeah.
one of the things I so appreciate, Charlie, your erudition, your ability to explain things, your ability to make connections. But more than anything, there's a love of people, there's a love of music as participatory co-creation. When I was learning about jazz, Downbeat magazine used to have a blind listening test, or they placed a song and not tell you who it was, and they asked different jazz artists to
Yeah, I
respond.
love those.
And when they had Louis Armstrong, they played the Dukes of Dixieland or the Firehouse Five, hoping that he would condemn them. And Armstrong said, I hear something in what everybody plays. It doesn't mean he thought it was equal virtuosity. It doesn't mean he thought it was equal complexity, but he thought you ought to be open to it. And this openness is something I so appreciate in you. There are long sections of 1970 songs that I have to go re-listen to because I thought they were filler. And after reading you, I understand that they're the point. And so thank you so much, for the work and for this conversation. And let's throw it, I don't know, Eric, if you're hosting the questions or if we're getting them off the chat.
I'm gonna be doing that, George. I'm presuming that sorry everybody, my technical problems meant that I was cutting in and out there, but I hope we've solved that now. So we have a bunch of questions already, and there's maybe time for a couple more if you want to throw those in the chat. But the first person we have is David Brackett, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Carl, and thanks to Charlie and George. It was a very stimulating conversation, and great to hear and see you both. And what I have to say, it's probably more of an impromptu blurb than a question, because I've been reading the book myself. And one of the things that really impresses me is just how you, Charlie, and your book encourage a kind of deep listening in which you sort of ask us to hear the multiple genres in each song. And I know this came up in the conversation, but I just want to emphasize that because that's one of the things that's really been striking to me. And that I know some people just have questions about, what is a genre and that kind of thing. I see those popping up here. But the book is not about reifying genre or defining what the contents of a genre are, but at least the parts I've read are very much, kind of teaching us to hear the ways in which individual songs participate in multiple genres, and that they contain multiple genres in them. So I don't know that I've ever seen that before, where someone is really listening to music in that way. And when it's pointed out, it's something that's very convincing, and I think will help people to really be alert to what's going on as they're listening. And it's also then there's the social resonances of those genres that are, kind of living in each individual recording and song. So I don't know if you want to comment on that. I realize it's not a question. It's one of those, I'm asking a question, but giving my own paper kind of thing. But I'm not really. I'm really just, it's something that I'm learning from reading the book. So that's what I wanted to say.
Well, and I really appreciate that. That's, the main thing that I think the book is trying to do. So I'm glad that you caught that. I mean, I think it's something that is not the only way to listen, but it's a way that I found valuable in, maybe even answering that question of, what a genre is. I mean, if a genre is this thing that can assert itself through the way a particular song is handling drum sounds, or from the way that, a particular, lead singer decides to wear a thin tie or a thick tie. I mean, then that tells us something about what genre is, and how it works. So yeah, that's definitely, I mean, the introduction is subtitled Listening for Genres, I think, and that's definitely, one of the key things I'm trying to do. So I appreciate your calling attention to that.
Yeah, I think we have next a related question from Florian Walsh, if Florian wants to unmute and join us.
Is my connection good enough for me to be intelligible right now is the question.
It is to me.
I think so, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Charles, thank you so much for the book. I've not been excited by a book this much, like in a long time.
Oh, thanks.
And my question concerns the tension between the organic metaphors and thinking of genres as relational and assemblages. And my question is about the relationship between genres and their original environment. And so the question is like, can genres die? Because right, in order to mean or to be heard as genres, recordings and texts alone are not enough, but you need to have an idea of the technologies used of these social movements engage, like the other musics it responds to. And I feel that compared to kind of like the texts and the records alone, a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good, yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and
And
something I
so
try to
the
get
question
at,
is
but
really like,
sorry.
what does it mean for genres to live or be livable? Sorry, yes, I'll stop
Yeah,
here.
no. I mean, I thank you for clarifying that, but that was, yeah, I got that from what you said. I mean, it's in a way a contention of the book that genres never really die, and that the things that people have said about genres that make them the half-life that Jameson talks about in commercial genres, and the idea of genres as kind of dead containers or after the fact accountings and so on, are usually misdirected. In some senses, genres are always there to be tapped into and participated in. And that's one thing that I'm really trying to argue in this book. And, it matters that there are genres that, live a life that's very precarious, like the nocturne, where, nobody's commissioning them. Nobody will be unhappy if there happens to be a couple years when nobody writes any new nocturnes, where the concerto, it's still in that circuit of virtuoso performers who need new works that are going to be performed in prestige settings like the New York Philharmonic and so on. Um, but as dead as a genre can ever be, it seems like it can always be reactivated, and all it takes, in a certain sense, is somebody alluding to it, drawing on its materials, gesturing toward its conventions. And when you get that, it gets to this point that you were saying, that if you don't have the people, it really matters in certain ways. And some people, some theorists of genre, would probably want to say that that is a dead genre, or it's not really a genre if there's not a community around it. But my contention is that this is a way too high bar, that it really matters that you have clusters of texts that can be heard together, or ways of being together, practices that unite people under the name of something like a genre name. And that even when that goes away or disappears for a moment, it doesn't mean that the genre is actually dead. It just means that another dimension of it has come to the fore. It just means that the people who, the people dimension may be very recessive at a moment when the making the records dimension is very robust, and vice versa. So, you know, um, I mean, I'm just answering your question by way of saying, yes, I really mean that in a certain way, genres never die. But I do acknowledge that, when they're only living on in the form of musical scores that not too many people hear, that don't get recorded and don't get published commercially, which is true for a lot of the pieces I talk about, it doesn't mean that genre is dead, you know.
We'll do a quick follow-up.
Um, I think we should keep moving on, Floyd. Thanks. But yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you. And I think we have Franklin Bruno next.
Hi, this seems super great, and I'm really taken with. I'm happy whenever someone is going to give convention some positive attention as a sort of inevitable element of both genre and just music making in general. But I just want to know, this may fall like at the end of the period you're dealing with, but I kind of want to know about the return of R&B as a genre label. Rhythm and blues is a term that, as my understanding, it first appears as a chart designation, supposedly maybe through Jerry Wexler at Billboard, and then soul becomes a kind of self-designation. I think there's records we call soul before people were using soul frequently. I think it's used in hard bop titles before it's used in pop. And this has to do with, as you mentioned, the stronger gospel element, although that gospel element was there in R&B in the older sense, post-war R&B too. And then at some point that I don't understand as well, if I understand those, R&B and rhythm and blues start to return as a genre label, maybe at the end of the certainly the 80s. And is that a political change? Is that a industrial change? Does it have specific stylistic musical markers, or how is that? I mean, is that something you have something to say about?
Yeah, it's a great, I mean, the book doesn't talk about this very much, but it's a fascinating question, and I'm talking about it in my soul music book a bit. And yeah, I mean, the beginning of the term soul has been very well written about by, well, David Brackett has written about this, Portia Maltby, of course, and more recently, Emily Lordy's great book talks about this quite a lot. But the end of the term soul and this kind of return of the term R&B is something that, as I hear it, it coincides with the digital turn. And I'm not sure why that is exactly. I mean, there's people who never stopped using the term R&B even during the high soul music era. And, I think that's because that's what they had grown up with. If you're the generation of somebody like, Linda Creed, let's say, it makes sense to keep using that term R&B. But this kind of shift to that term again in and not rhythm and blues, but just R&B seems to take hold, once you get this more drum machine and digital, kind of MIDI driven sequence, kind of black mainstream popular music around 1983, 1984. I mean, that's when I start to see it again as a kind of standard term, and soul really had to have disappeared. Um, that doesn't exactly line up culturally with what has been called the post-soul era. And so there's definitely unpacking that needs to happen there. So yeah, you're suggesting to me that I need to kind of disentangle this a little bit better. But it's an interesting development, that return of R&B as the term for kind of mainstream black popular music around
Yeah,
1983, 84.
it's not something a pointed question. Oh, is this a problem? It's just something I don't understand either, and was
Yeah.
on what you thought. Thanks.
Thank you, Franklin. I think Scott Saul is up next.
Thanks so much, Charlie. I can't wait to read this book. And my question comes from my experience teaching a class on the 70s and really struggling with how to frame the period in a way that the students are kind of alive to everything going on, and specifically the sense of belatedness, which I think was strongly felt at the time, that like they were in this deep funk of the post-60s moment. But also, this realization that I think a lot of historians have about the 70s, that this is a time of incredible organizing of social movements. I mean, obviously, ones that sometimes are associated with the 60s, like, radical feminism and so on. But really go, burgeon on a mass scale, it's the 70s. And so my question is, how do we put these things together? And I'm really interested in the 70s-ness of your book. And, is there a way that we see this playing out differently in particular genres?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that the main way I like to answer that, I think, is that the 70s, it's really marked by a kind of multiplicity and variety and intensity of, what people can care about, and a range of what people can care about, which means that you have, possibilities that are not foreclosed but are hardly guaranteed. And it's a lot different from the utopian moment that we associate with the high 60s. And it's different from the sense of the closing off of possibility that takes hold in the 80s. And so that you have this range of things that can be backward looking, even in a single genre, backward looking, forward looking, thoroughly invested in the present without any concern for anything before or after. These can all coexist, and that it matters that you can have, on the one hand, deep investment in writing a song about a particular issue of the day that needs talking about. At the same time, you can come back in the studio next week and record a song about a dog. Well, actually, I have a dog. I mean, that's not a trivial thing, but but you can record a song about, can we get you hot? May we make your temperatures rise? So the range of things is what makes the 70s special. The unpredictability at the level of what's going to come to the fore and why. What are people going to care about? Where is something going to take hold? A particular cultural formation. So different genres have different ways of doing that, but they all seem to have these strains that are, very conservative or content to reside, to abide with their old conventions, and elements that want to reject those and push free and do something different. The coexistence of all these things, the fact that you have musicians, especially listening across that whole spectrum very ecumenically. This is something like Ndugu Leon Chancellor told me when I was interviewing him a while back that, like we listen to everything, and he listed what he meant by everything, and it was kind of everything, and that is something that is special about the 70s. I mean, even if people had had that mindset in the 50s or 60s, just in musical terms, it would have been very different. In the 70s, you could actually do that. But it was not as easy in the sense that it is easy now to do it on Spotify or whatever. You actually had to find the records, and people talk about the difficulty of, I'm reviewing this, Vince Aletti, I'm reviewing this Gil Scott Heron record. It's great, but it's going to be hard to find. That is very 70s. So.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Can't wait to dig into the playlist and the book.
Oh, thank you.
I think Sonnet Redman is up next. Sonnet?
Thank you, Carl. Charlie, this is a wonderful book. I can't wait to read it. I just wanted to hear a little bit more. I loved this idea of the genre as self-theorizing entity. We so often think about genre in terms of markets or style and aesthetics, listeners, scenes, but I guess I'd just like to hear you say more about that. And then also, I guess it's just you can take that question up, or is the self-theorizing aspect of genre always in genre, or is that part of the 70s-ness of the genre
Yeah,
the
that's a
genre
great,
you're talking
yeah.
about?
No, that's a great question. I mean, the second, maybe just to answer the second one first, because I think that is one of the things that's special about the 70s. I mean, there is something about that multiplicity and the variety that emerges out of that multiplicity that means that genres can do certain kinds of cultural work that didn't exactly happen before or since. I mean, there are things in the 50s and 60s that I really want to talk about in the same terms, and things in the 80s and after that, I want to talk about in the same terms, but there's something about the 70s where, you know, all of this kind of permeated these genres in ways that really hasn't happened before or since. I mean, I think about, if you think about, like in fashion, like the men's suit, I mean, that it's a decade when 70s aesthetics so permeated even the most kind of buttoned up, law firm type suit that shaped that, reshaped it literally to correspond to the aesthetics of the day. That's something that didn't really happen in the 50s and 60s and in the 80s and 90s and after. I don't think. I mean, I guess we need a fashion historian to prove me right or wrong about that. But but that kind of thing I think is sort of special. But about this sort of self-theorizing aspect of genres, I think that that's one of the things that follows from an acknowledgement that, genre identities are relational, that, a genre only makes sense if you put it into relation with other genres that are happening either in its stream, like thinking about soul in relation to gospel and other genres that precede it and happen alongside it. And, genres like rock and pop that, may come partly from different strands, but that soul is interacting with in the 70s, to go beyond that and say that, soul music not only interacts with these other genres and is only understood in relation to these other genres, but that, it has a picture of the world of genre around it and the world more broadly that comes out of where it places emphasis, what it suggests about the people who participate in it, what it says about places and institutions where it's thriving and not thriving, that it gives you a picture of the world, and it theorizes what genres are good for in a way that's very different from the way that rock might be theorizing what genres are good for at that same moment. So I don't know if that, answers your question, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it.
No, thank you. That's fascinating. Great work.
Thanks.
Glenn Hendler, I think you are next in queue.
Yeah, and I can do sound. This book sounds amazing. I'll just add to the chorus of people saying that, and I've ordered it right away. And this is another what do you mean by genre question? You partially answered it in response to Sonnet Redmond, I think, but I'll ask it anyway. When asking a question about the definition of genre, George immediately turned to theorization of genre in film, right? Thinking about Howard Hawks, etc. And my question is, how much does genre work as a term across different mediums or media, like film, music, literature, etc.? And how much is there something distinctive about the way you use the concept of genre in talking about music?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Yeah, maybe here too, I'll credit Georgina Bourne for talking about this with music as well. That the key element, I think, would be the element of time. The multi-temporality of music is something that makes it special. That music, in some ways, imposes time on experience in a way that a poem, even though you have to read it from beginning to end, and a film, even though you watch it from beginning to end, does not, I don't think. I mean, the multi-temporality of music includes, the micro level of, the kind of, you know, phenomenology of aesthetic experience from like micro moment to micro moment, and it includes beat, meter, phrase, section, musical form more broadly, and so on. But it also includes all the temporalities of composing, working in the studio, overdubbing, you know, um, listening to playback, remembering things from your musical past, getting to the studio on time, and all of this other kind of stuff. And, film has those, complex temporalities at many different levels and of many different sorts too. But, music's are a unique set. And, that's something that makes, a musical genre a special kind of entity, that it can be understood at this very kind of micro phenomenological level, as well as at the level of like, how do you put together a song from beginning to end, and what is it like experiencing it in a moment, as well as like the rhythms of making records and marketing records and, having them, connect with other records of their kind. That's something that makes a musical genre distinctive, I think. That would be the one, if I had to list one thing, that would be it, the multi-temporality of music.
Great. Well, since Georgina Bourne came up in that answer, coincidentally, Georgina Bourne is the next person with a question.
Hi, can you hear me? The wonders of Zoom. Hey, Charlie, wonderful book. Thank you so much for, the incredible labor of creating this extraordinary book. I have a question, but I just wanted to start by saying, the book and the way you've discussed it with George and everybody else today, it's like a methodological kind of compendium, That's one of the qualities of it. Like the way you've made so natural the idea of treating Western art music as generic, and on the other hand, looking at the singularity of, apparently the most hackneyed soul track or disco moment from the 70s, which I find amazing. And another one would be how you are insistent on the detail that makes so much difference. And I'm kind of contrasting that in my head with the way, music information retrieval picks up details, but they're always the wrong details. Like they never get at the details that actually matter, musically or sonically or whatever. So I want to thank you for this incredibly rich kind of set of lessons, that's in the book, apart from all the historical richness you've been talking about. My question is about care, because care is a term that you use, which is really kind of, it's buzzing. It's like very rich and attractive. And you use it to talk about those details that matter, that move us or that sort of shift things along. And, you know, in the old days, we would have said, oh, you know, it was like innovative, it was inventive, it was experimental, you know, it something like that. But you insist on this language of care. And I just wanted to like pick that up and ask you, you know, why? And I suppose if I'm being a trickster, I would say that to use a language of care could be to kind of make it seem as if this matters to everybody, you know, the wide tie or whatever it is that matters, that we care about, as if it's like a God's eye view. And, you know, but I'm not sure you're doing that. But obviously it has to be linked to some kind of awareness of competence in the way we often talk about in relation to genre, that people kind of have to know something to know about, you know, what to care about. So maybe you could just talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you, because that is a key concept for the book, and I know it may read funny. I mean, it's a word that, you know, I got interested in, a concept I got interested in partly because of its, you know, relative absence from ethical traditions. You know, it's something that hasn't been talked about in philosophy all that much until recently, and then, you know, some of the more famous papers recently. Yeah, David, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but something like Harry Frankfurt's The Importance of What We Care About has gotten a little bit of critique and deserves it for assuming that care and importance go together. And so a lot of what I talk about in the book, I mean, maybe this doesn't get really spelled out until the afterword, is that genres are important. Importance is a bad word to use. As J.L. Austin says, importance isn't that important. Um, the the part of what care does is that it maps onto things that might not matter, you know, especially care for genres, care in music, about music. It's really key to the concept of care that it can map onto things that don't matter, that might not matter. And if that's the case, it raises ethical questions like, why are you writing a whole song about, you know, can we get you hot? May we make your temperatures rise, when all this other stuff is going on around us? Or why in the late 60s are you, you know, when all the strikes are happening, why are you worrying about whether you can get a harpsichord in the studio to play these 4 chords, you know? And it matters that people have done this, you know, because it shows that, you know, care does not attach to things that are the most important. And I think that it's something that by attending, you know, to where we can actually see effort, care, attention, time, even money invested, it's interesting, you know, especially when it flows in directions that you think don't deserve it, or that a genre doesn't seem to underwrite explicitly. When those those sort of flows of care happen, it's important to follow them. Partly because it's helping us get closer to people. And you know, you've used this phrase, history as ethnography, and that's kind of, you know, kind of what I'm trying to do with some of this stuff. So you know, that's one place where care is really important, because it gets us to think about, you know, what does a person maybe without that expert knowledge, you know, take from a song like this, you know.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think also it presumably connects to the whole resurgence of a concern with sort of social reproduction and labor and so on. But you're taking it to music, which is really an interesting, lovely move. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That's so fascinating. Thank you. And I think we can squeeze a couple more in before we say goodbye. Chris Murphy, tell us what you care about.
I think you're muted. I'm not hearing you anyway.
Yeah, I'm not hearing you, Chris.
You don't look muted, but
Can you hear me now?
yes.
That
Thanks.
did it. Sorry, I had to change my Zoom settings. Echoing what a previous questioner said, having listened to this talk, I immediately put your book in my shopping cart, and I can't wait to read it.
Oh, thank you.
And I want to ask, I guess I'll ask this somewhat provocatively, having gone through writing a book recently myself. Did writing this book sort of give you a rooting interest, for lack of a better term, in the perpetuation of genre? And I ask that from the perspective of someone who just wrote a book about Lil Nas X.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, if I had a nickel for every time I've written the phrase makes a mockery of genre in the last 5 years, I don't know if I'd have $1 million, but I'd probably have enough for lunch. And, you know, whether it's a song like Steve Lacy's Bad Habit, which Billboard managed to slot on both its alternative chart and its R&B chart, or it's, you know, obviously Old Town Road, the subject of my book. When the Old Town Road contretemps blew up in 2019, you had critics like Carrie Batan at the New Yorker literally in headlines calling for the end of genre. And writing my book, I found myself perhaps curmudgeonly sticking to what I think is valuable still about genre. And one of the things I'm enjoying about hearing you talk about the definition of genre and the boundaries of genre is the cultural value of genre. And I wonder if, you know, having done this book, it reinforced your belief in genre. Because even the artists fight against the strictures of genre. And, you know, Eric's scholarship on format versus genre informs here too, and I've referenced his book in my book. But nonetheless, I'd love to know where you come down on that.
Yeah, I mean, probably, I mean, I certainly went into the book wanting to defend the usefulness of the concept and, you know, came out of the process still feeling like it, you know, it does govern a lot of aesthetic activity, you know, during this long decade. And I think you know, the ways that people, as you say, like artists kind of, you know, reject it, talk around it, deny their involvement in one or the other. I mean, I think that there's worth, you know, there's a lot there in the particulars of how and when artists reject or embrace genre as a whole or particular genres. And what I found empirically in the 70s is that, you know, those disavowals happen in very programmatic ways and not that often in certain sense. Like the idea that, you know, people are much more likely to reject a particular genre or to reject the idea of being pigeonholed in the genre or to be Maureen Mann's book is great on this, you know, be shut out from a genre because of your ethnicity or your gender. You know, people complain about that as much as they complain about being pigeonholed within a genre when they want to do something elsewise. You know, is elsewise a word? But you know, yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, it's one of those things that can never quite go away. I mean, it's always useful to listen to a song in light of the genres it participates in, and you know, that's why it becomes really important to hear, you know, let's say an individual song you're trying to listen to, like Old Town Road, you know, against, you know, the different sets of conventions and practices associated with the genres that it, you know, tentatively embraces in various ways. You know, I mean, the backing beat came from a world completely outside of country, and that matters. And you know, I mean, I'm looking forward to reading your book. I haven't seen it yet, but um, yeah, but it's
Later
a
this year.
fascinating, yeah, okay, it's a fascinating case study. So, yeah, I'm really curious. But yeah, I still think genre is an interesting thing to kind of pose to yourself about a given text or event, you know, or practice that you're dealing with because it's going to have interesting answers, even if some of those answers are negative, you know, and, you know, where rejections of genres cluster, you know, historically and, you know, around what sorts of practices, that's really interesting too. So again, I think, you know, I'm always kind of looking more empirically at this stuff and trying to find, you know, where do these avowals and disavowals happen and what do they mean? What do they do? You know, so
Thank you.
thank you.
That's great. Appreciate it.
Let's try to let's see if we can just move a couple more quickly in before we wrap up. Tanya Slayman, if you're still out
Hi.
there.
Yeah, I was just unmuting. Congrats on the book. I've asked the Film Arts Department librarian to order it here in Iceland, so it's going to be making its way to the Icelandic community. My question is brief. It's about stakeholders from the business side, Charlie, who might try to rebrand something to get it to be more successful in the marketplace, and whether when a genre asks us to listen for it, does it work if the song really belongs in a different genre, but someone stuck it into, you know, square hole peg thing. And I'd love to hear your comments about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have to say, I look at, I mean, it's a great question. I try to deal with this a little bit. And, you know, again, the kind of micro socialities of this can be really interesting when you look at particular cases. But I try to look even-handedly at the ways and reasons and different entities that can place something in a genre or place it out of a genre, so that, it's important to pay attention to what the gatekeepers are doing, what the money people are doing. But those can have effects on a song that can be ultimately positive. I mean, it's purely, I think it really varies case to case. They can have very positive effects on a song being misplaced, put in the wrong genre, and things that, on the other hand, come from inside the maker's heads, about genre, consciousness of some forebear, or wanting to get outside of a genre that you've grown up in, or feeling like you should like a genre better than you do, so you want to make something of that. Those can have negative effects just as easily as positive ones, even though that would seem to come from something more organic or more connected with the work of making art. So I mean, I think it's important, again, to kind of map out and pay attention to all of the different things that work to place a song in or out of a particular genre, and to acknowledge that with any text we look at, that's going to be happening in multiple ways, probably with multiple genres, with many different kinds of entity, impinging on the thing, whether it's an institution, your, I don't know, your job description, your instrument, your parents, your record label, whatever, they're all contributing to this, and it's unpredictable in a given case what's going to have what effect. So, I mean, it's definitely something to follow, but there's a lot of interesting music that comes out of, square peg round hole relationships. So, it's that's an interesting thing about genre too, I think.
Great, and would have time. I think that this was a question. Lucretia, Ty, Jasmine, did you want to round us off here?
Sure. I'll be quick. This is super cool. This conversation's fascinating. I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I agree about the 70s, multiplicity and diversity. How did that, how can we hear that change in the 80s?
I mean, some of it is, record company consolidation and changes in marketing, and, an increasing emphasis on the top of the PR pyramid at the expense for a while of, mining genres. I mean, the idea when you start promoting megastars instead of mining genres, it changes kind of what gets heard by people and what circulates how. I think that's a big part of it. I think some of it is, Tim Lawrence talks about this. I mean, it's some of it is changes in institutions, gentrification, closing down this club, that club. You have fewer places to perform. It becomes less feasible to travel with a live band in certain ways at certain points. You have the digital turn means that you don't need a band. You can record something that will chart, in your bedroom, and aesthetically that has a lot of wonderful results, but it definitely, changes the degree, I think, of variety that you have, in genres of Black music. It creates different sets of arrangements about what counts as the present and what counts as the past. When you've got, the digital sounds counting as the present, it means that ways of making music that would have been viable in the 70s are now, kind of old-fashioned, or deliberately or not retro. So, I mean, I think there's a shift that happens, to my mind, mostly because of the, set of, economic, financial, finance capital shifts, industry shifts, and the shifts in, you know, production, toward the digital, in material culture terms, toward the cassette and then the CD, changes what gets out there and how, so I think a lot of that is what happens to close it down.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you. And on that note, that's a slightly mournful note, it seems like a good place to close. I really, really want to thank Charlie and George for the presentation, and all of you for these really fantastic questions.